So thank you for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. So, because my talk today is part of this larger project, which is both an ethnography of a school and an ethnography of schooling, I figure I'll give you a little bit of a context. I mean, some of you have heard this before if you know my work, but I know a lot of you haven't. So, just to give some context for the focus, in particular on religious education and what I've titled Constructing Proper Faith. I began my interest in schools quite some time ago, and I began by doing sort of 2 or 3 months of just observation and.
I want you to move your water.
Oh, sorry. Observation at a girls' secondary school, initially in a small town in Jordan, and it was because I was interested in education, and I started thinking about the significance of that space of the school for adolescent girls in particular, and in the first community I was in, as well as the city where I did my research, it really was quite a significant space for young women that didn't necessarily have access to many other public spaces, if we can think of the school as a public space, and it is in some respects. And these are public schools and public institutions, and so it's also the place in which they interface with the state most directly. But in a community where, I mean, young men in the communities I was in didn't really have many spaces as in institutions or youth groups or anything of that kind, but they hung out in the street. And that option usually, or almost never, was available to young women in the communities I was working in because it just wasn't respectable. And so schools are an important place, physical place in their lives. And this is what initially motivated this research. In the initial work that I did, I was really struck by a couple of things. One was these very open and frank discussions about the role of women in Jordan. And some of it was prompted by my own sort of questions, but others were prompted by things in the text and sometimes inconsistencies in the text about women's work, for example. And so there were really pretty diverse opinions circulating in what was, relatively speaking, initially in the first community I was in, a very homogeneous community. Not that, I mean, as an anthropologist, that's problematic even to say. But in the larger scheme of things, given our given our assumptions, or let's say the persistence of generalizations in the public discourse about Arab Muslim women, it struck me even further that here I was in this town of 7,000 people. A large majority of them were related to each other. There was no religious diversity, and it was a relatively conservative community. Even though terms like conservative are problematic, I'm going to be using them a lot, based on Jordanians' sort of own assessment of particularly social conservatism and who gets labeled conservative or not conservative in this context. And I'll be talking about this a little bit more. So it struck me this sort of differences of opinion, the persistence of this kind of debate, and the sort of ambiguity about what their role might be in Jordan as educated women as the impetus for a lot of this debate. And the other thing that struck me, too, is this sort of deep faith in education, which I guess on some level shouldn't have been surprising to me, but this deep faith in education as a path to life improvement and the kind of status that came with being an educated person almost across the board, and particularly for young women. I guess perhaps this is what was a little bit surprising for me, particularly for young women. Although as I delve into pretty deeply in the larger project, what an improved life might be is something that might surprise us and doesn't necessarily fit into the typical assumptions about what an improved life might be. So education is critical to improving one's life, but what an improved life might be is something that could be quite diverse in the perspective of these young women and their families. So this led me to do a fuller, longer ethnography, so about a year spent in another high school in a city of about 60,000 people. It was one of 3 girls' high schools in this city. And so I spent a year there, and increasingly I began to think of the project as I said when I started, the ethnography of the school, but also an ethnography of schooling as this national, global kind of project for developing women. And so trying to historicize that project, as well as think about in this sort of contemporary moment, what does this mean in both state discourse and policies, as well as global development kind of discourse about women in the region. And so these sort of 3 levels are the ways in which I've conceptualized the larger project, and it comes through in pretty interesting ways in thinking about religion and religious education. So just to recap a little bit about the three levels as it frames the larger project too. So there's first, as I said, the importance of these local spaces for young women. So these as local institutions that are physically important spaces for young women, and also important as sort of windows onto local manifestations of some larger debates. Then thinking about schools as important national projects of socializing young people, critical to the state's own vision of what development is and how women fit into development. And I'm going to go into this a little bit more because there's, in some ways, it's quite problematic. The ways in which the state's been theorized in schooling has some serious limits, and I'm going to talk about that, particularly vis-a-vis religion. And then finally, again, sort of thinking about the significance of being educated and what I began to think of as schooling as a project in and of itself, a project that transforms some of the most basic ideas of what's moral, what's good, who's respectable. And so thinking about how those kinds of transformations, as well as sort of the challenge to traditional sources of authority and traditional sources of knowledge, work to make schooling in and of itself a significant factor or a significant variable in trying to understand the experiences of these young women and their families, because that's sort of what I always bring it back to. And in terms of my talk today and thinking about religion, the ways in which schooling not only challenges sort of traditional sources of authority or moral authority, but even opens up to debate basic ideas about what is good on some levels, and sometimes it's not as explicit. And this is all a very gendered process as well, because of all these new conceptualizations of womanhood and progress for women, and the religious dimensions of that. And again, sort of thinking about defining proper faith as key to this project of defining proper or legitimate paths of womanhood for adolescent girls. So, so this is sort of, I've just kind of framed the larger project. And initially my project, so why I focus on religion, initially the project was not, my intention was not to go study religious education in a public school. And these are public schools, but public schools teach religion as a core part of their curriculum, and this is true in all public schools in the region. So thinking about what sort of pointed me to religion, I didn't start out wanting to focus on religious education per se, or the religious lives of young women even, but on one level it emerged as something important, right? It emerged as something important for some girls in this school that I was in. It was an important part of their own sort of trying to define who they were, trying to define who they could be, and because of that it was something I had to pay attention to. And it was also it played out in an interesting way in the school I was in, as there were sort of contests over authority surrounding religious knowledge between the teacher, between some students, between the text, which is sort of the image that the state wants to put forth about religion and legitimate knowledge. And that's the meat of what I'm going to talk about today, are sort of these conflicts that I saw in one particular school. But the other reason why I increasingly became interested in thinking about religion in the school that I was working in. Oh, the other thing I should say is, too, there was also one very dynamic religion teacher who I ended up spending a lot of time in her classroom and talking with her, and it was a story that I sort of needed to tell, because she was interesting in many ways, and there were a lot of surprises about what was going on in her classroom, both pedagogically as well as in terms of the kinds of gendered lessons that she was trying to convey to the students in her class. But I'd say but this work is also in response to what I saw as a gap in the literature on schooling in the region. There's been quite a bit of interest in education in the Muslim world, but there's been very little actual research conducted in schools in the region in general, and in religious classrooms in particular. And so this is one thing that struck me. A lot of the analysis of religion in the region has been relying on curriculum and analysis of curriculum, so no real attention to how this sort of plays out in schools, and definitely not in public schools, because the degree to which there's been some deeper kind of analysis of religious education that I've seen that's more qualitative in nature, it's tended to be in private schools. And part of this is about access and the difficulty in accessing public schools in the region. and part of it is about convenience and the kind of research. I mean, it's easier to get a set of religion textbooks and analyze that, particularly because because of the sort of public interest in a place like the United States in religion and education. It's an area in which a lot of people have come to out of have come to as a result of political developments and foreign policy. And so on the one hand, so this is another piece of framing this work, is thinking about the gap in the literature and the heavy reliance on textbooks. The other thing I would say is even the research on Islam and Islamism in the region, even the anthropology of religion in the region, has largely ignored the role of schools, with a couple of important exceptions, but has largely ignored the role of schools, sort of seeing the school as the arena of the state and as an arena in which not much interesting could happen as a result, and paying attention to other spheres of learning and teaching about religion. So ignoring the school and sort of assuming, I would say, what's going on in there. One important exception is Gregory Start has a book, Putting Islam to Work. It's not an ethnography of schools. I mean, he doesn't spend that much time in schools, but he really problematizes this assumption that what the state project for religious education in the school is that we should take this as a given. And he points to ways in which, through a discourse kind of analysis and a textual analysis, the ways in which the state project of sort of packaging religion in a particular way in the Egyptian context has quite unintended effects in terms of the ways in which people think about religion and think about how they can use religion in their daily lives. And I'll talk a little bit more about his book later on. And there's been some work about literacy and mass literacy and the ways in which this changes access to religious knowledge and authority over religious knowledge and sort of democratizing the access to religious knowledge. Dale Eichelman has written a little bit about that as well. So that gives us some of the literary context for thinking about this. So why are schools important? I mean, I've talked about some of this already before I'm going to get to my school, I promise, in a second. But why are schools important to debates about religious orthodoxy, debates about religious authority? There are a number of reasons. One, again, as I said, even though I think we need to problematize public schools as state institutions, they are state institutions, and the state uses them to convey a particular vision of what Islam is and what legitimate knowledge is. And it's important to understand what those images are that the state is trying to convey. Although even when we talk about the state, we're talking sometimes about different actors who aren't necessarily in unison in this. And in Jordan, you see this even in the textbooks. You might get a completely different message about women's work in the civic education textbook than the religion textbook. And in part, this has to do with who's working at the Ministry of Education and who's authoring these textbooks. And they're all technically civil servants, and they're all technically sort of part of the state, but not necessarily acting in unison. So this is just one example. And there was an interesting book about education in Turkey, too, by Sam Kaplan, where he talks a lot about sort of trying to unpack the state and the different kind of state actors and understanding the competing kind of interests at the national level. The other thing is, as I said again, the importance of these spaces for young people and young women in particular. And the other reason is thinking about the sort of temporal space that young women are in, thinking about adolescence and thinking about what in some ways is universal, although there are many things unique about it for young women in Jordan, but this sort of figuring out who I am and religion as being an important part of that throughout the world, not just in Jordan. So thinking about young people's struggles to sort of make meaning, be significant, become popular in some respects. Religion is one of those options for young people throughout the world. I read a couple of, in the interest of sort of trying to contextualize my folks in adolescent kind of experiences, I've read some interesting work about teenagers in the U.S. and their spiritual lives, as well as evangelical Christians, ethnography of evangelical Christian youth in one particular university, as well as Hasidic Jews. And there are definitely some commonalities about this age and this sort of trying to figure out, young people trying to figure out how does religion, spirituality, God, depending on where their starting point is, fit in their lives. So seeing this as part of that endeavor, and it's not necessarily the most popular option here or in Jordan for that matter, because for some of the girls who are sort of trying to find themselves, religion is not part of the picture, and there are sort of competing visions of what it is to be popular or cool there as there would be anywhere else. And so I'll talk a little bit about how some of the more religious young women in my ethnography are received by their peers. But there is something unique. I mean, there's always something unique about every context and time. But sort of in the Jordanian context, and thinking about young women in particular, the relative newness of mass education, is quite new transformations, dramatic transformations of family, work, public space, means that the questions about faith, and particularly the gender dimensions of questions about faith, are particularly fraught with ambiguity and tension in this particular historical moment in Jordan, and that's something that I explore. And this ambiguity is not just for women, because young men are struggling with this as well too, particularly as their sort of role as the provider, economic provider, is challenged by economic realities. But for young women, it's fraught on a deeper level by the reality that even what their role should be is sort of up for debate and question in some respects, what their role should be in a modern Jordan, and there's sort of competing narratives about what that might be. And the gender dimensions of the religious debate are oftentimes the most public and obvious kinds of larger debates about what it means to be a good Muslim, right? Because of the symbols of the veil and the debates about proper gender roles and motherhood. So there's some of the most obvious ways in which debates about religion unfold in a place like Jordan. So I spent a year in this girls' high school that I call Al Khatwa High School, in a city of about 60,000 people. And for those of you who know Arabic, you can see some of my, it means step, taking a step. It means step. Yeah. So I spent a year there, and I want to talk about sort of 3 significant ways in which I saw religious education unfolding. One I'll just talk about briefly, and just say that just like any other dimension of social cultural life in Jordan, there were everyday, very small ways in which people were involved in sort of pointing each other in the right direction. You might ask a teacher might ask another teacher about prayer, or might ask, about a particular holiday and what should I do on this holiday, or a group of young women might debate with each other whether this was appropriate behavior for a good Muslim or not. So there were just sort of everyday ways in which, not for everyone, but for many people in the context I was in, people were involved in sort of educating each other in small ways, right, about what it means to be a better Muslim. But in the context of the school, I spent quite a bit of time. I ended up observing something like 30, 40 religion classes with one particular teacher. And then I also spent some time, a teacher named Miss Suhaib. And I also spent some time with a group of young women, students in the school, who were a prayer room committee. There was a prayer room on the campus, which was there so that girls could pray during their break if they wanted to. But there was a prayer room committee that organized activities in the prayer room. And the president of the prayer room committee while I was there was this very dynamic, sort of self-made, in-school preacher who ends up being a pretty significant figure in the year that I'm there, and ends up being sort of a foil sometimes for the religion teacher. So it sets up this kind of interesting dynamic that I ended up focusing quite a bit in my work. So I want to tell you a little bit about these 2 characters, and then think about some questions that what I observed raised for me, and then some of my attempts to analyze these things that I observed. So Miss Suhail was a religion teacher, and I had been observing all classes, all subjects. I'd just been trying the first month or 2 that I was there, I was just trying to spend as much time in the classroom and with folks at the school as I could. And then I eventually decided to spend more time in Miss Suhail's class, because it was one of the classes where there was a lot more debate and discussion, and the girls were really engaged in debating things, talking with her, whereas a lot of the classes I just sit there and, particularly math and physics, there wasn't much more that I could get from watching that dynamic unfold. So I ended up spending a lot of time with Ms. Suhail, and she was quite unique in many respects. First, just as a teacher, pedagogically, she was was working on her PhD in education, but she herself was sort of self-taught. She wanted me to get her a book about emotional intelligence. She had been blogging about these issues. She thought a lot about teaching and what it meant to be a good teacher, and was really sort of focusing on her practice and would try different methods in the classroom, and things that were quite surprising. I mean, things that our own teachers still struggle with here in the United States, right? Small group, problem solving, I mean, the kinds of things, the sort of buzzwords of ed reform were things she was thinking about trying to implement in the class. The other thing is that she typically used her class as a social critique, two kinds of social critique. One, she has sort of two mantras, the problem with tradition and how tradition was holding us back and how tradition was sort of holding Islam back. And this is not a new narrative at all, but I mean, this idea of sort of tradition being the problem with the way in which religion is being practiced. But this, and her other mantra was the media and how the media was problematic, and she would have all sorts of discussions about programs that the kids were watching and discuss with them what was wrong with these programs. And then the other thing is she really took quite sort of feminist positions as well. Feminists, I mean, the term feminists doesn't really tell us much, right, unless we understand the context. But what do I mean when I say feminist? One of her other regular mantras was to continually reinforce the idea to the girls that they could be whatever they wanted, that their faith did not stand in the way of them being whatever they wanted, that they could be doctors, journalists, I mean, et cetera, which, you know, there were many of already in this society. So this is not such a dramatic thing for her to be saying, but just constant sort of mantra of you can be what you want to be. In her own sort of, so she, criticism of what she saw as more conservative religious elements in the community, including Amina, the school preacher, the student who was the school preacher. So she would reference things that Amina had said in other contexts. Like Amina might say something like, you should not wear a pink headscarf because that draws attention to yourself. Ms. Suhail would say things like, God loves things that are beautiful. Pink is beautiful. Why not wear beautiful? I mean, why not wear pink? So, I mean, so this is just one example. Or Amina, who in the larger scheme of this community and in this school was quite socially conservative, who said, I'm not going to university because it's co-ed and I won't go to a co-ed university. I'll go to the community college because it's not co-ed. In a community where most people strove and aimed for going to university, male and female, this was a pretty conservative kind of pronouncement on her part. Ms. Suhail would say things like, there are people who tell you that going to university is going to create all kinds of chaos in society. We've all gone to university. Has anything happened? You know, this, and all of these teachers in her school are all university grads for the most part. I mean, there's an older generation that went to community college, but here she is, Ms. Suhail, working on a PhD, and there are two other teachers in the school working on a PhD. So she uses Amina as a way to sort of critique what she sees as more conservative religious element. And sometimes she very explicitly says, she critiques what are called piety movements. And she says there are people who are involved in these piety movements, or dawah, which means calling. There are people who are involved in these dawah movements here in Jordan, but they don't go about it the right way. They're too pushy, and they try and force you to do things that you shouldn't do. And they say, cover your face, and there's nothing in Islam that says you should cover your face. So there's this kind of discussion going on where Amina, who's part of these kind of piety movements outside of school, ends up sort of being material for Ms. Suhail to then raise her own critique of these piety movements outside of school. And in this respect, Ms. Suhail very much fits into the official line about, official as in state line, about the need for moderation in faith, the importance of faith, but the dangers of being too extreme in one's faith. So she's not going against anything officially in her pronouncements of this kind, although she spends a lot of time in her class talking about things that are not in the text. And she's teaching, she's taught in a couple of different classes, but I spent a lot of time in what was called Islamic upbringing. And as opposed to some of the other Islamic classes that the students had to take, which were more about doctrine, or the texts, jurisprudence, Islamic upbringing was more about sort of how do we be a good Muslim in the contemporary world. So there might be a chapter on Islam and work, and the rights of the worker, and how a worker should treat his employee, and how an employer should treat his employee. And so the material itself was sort of conducive to this kind of applying to society, but she'd quickly go through the lesson and then say, yeah, the problem with our society is they don't value certain kinds of work. And there was very much a class critique embedded in her analysis as well. And I think that's part of trying to understand her uniqueness, because she used the classroom platform often to critique what she saw as elite corruption, as well as what she saw as barriers to the girls and others succeeding. She critiqued sort of the economic barriers. She didn't often explicitly talk about it in class terms, although a couple of times she did. But it was clear that what she was talking about were the kinds of capital available, capital both economic and social capital available to some folks in Jordan and not others. So Amina is the president of the prayer room. She's an 11th grader, and she's dynamic, happy, content. She not only leads lessons in the prayer room, given the opportunity, she'll give a spontaneous kind of lecture in a classroom for 15 minutes. She'll stand up to answer a question, and we'll go on and on for 10 or 15 minutes. And she's very much engaged in trying to point her peers in the right direction, and right in her perspective. One of the first times I sat down with her, she said to me, "I don't want you to think that these girls represent the true Islam." And I mean, clearly what this is all about is who gets to define true Islam, right? From the text to even Ms. Suhail, right? Because Ms. Suhail is the religion teacher. So she's supposed to be defining what the true Islam is in school. That's her realm of authority. So in some sense, her conflicts with Amina are not just about differences of opinion, but are about, hey, wait a minute, I'm the religion teacher. And there's even more to that, because Ms. Suhail used to spend more time in the prayer room giving lessons, and then was sort of pushed out because the school was uncomfortable with that. But they felt safer about a student being in there. And I've thought a lot about why they felt safer about the student being in there. But just to say a tiny bit more about Amina, too, Amina came from quite a religious family, saw herself as a preacher in training, was involved in sort of preaching to other women outside of school, and had very strong and clear opinions about what this meant for her future and what she would study and what she would do. Now, not all the girls actively involved in the prayer room fit that same profile. I mean, she happened to fit that profile. But one of her closest friends who was actively involved in the prayer room had actually been sort of brought to a more religious lifestyle by her sister, who went to the university and got involved in the religious group. And then the sister sort of subsequently came home and started preaching to her own family, who had not been very religious. So there are different ways in which this comes about. And sometimes the school is the trigger, right? Sometimes, much like it's happened throughout the region, it's a younger generation that's sort of returning to religion, not very accurate, the returning to religion, but becoming more religious or taking on new kind of trappings of religiosity that are quite new and quite modern in their form. But this is often happening with the younger generation, as well as sort of their class dimensions to it too. Sort of a new middle class, a new professional class is a lot of where the new religious kind of movements, new as in the last 2 or 3 decades, have emerged in the region. And I see patterns of this in Jordan as well, and in the community I was in Jordan. So, so there are, just to try and so I've given you a couple of little pictures, and there are other kinds of things going on about religion. But the religion classroom is significant here, not because it's religion class as much as it's because it's Ms. Suhail and what she does with it. But I also start to think about what is the significance of the fact that it is religion class, and trying to understand what the significance of, trying to understand what was unfolding in her class and this sort of conflict with Amina. And then in terms of Amina, what I thought a lot about was why is she given so much space to do what she's doing, particularly because it really is sort of against the grain of what the dominant kind of official discourse is. And yes, it exists in lots of places in Jordan, but you would think that in the school that there would be some degree of control over presenting this message. Because it's a state school, and because even if the administrators agreed with Amina, they'd be worried about what, so part of what, they'd be worried about the repercussions. So part of my thinking about this was why she's given completely free rein. And even when she's sometimes quite challenging to the idea of sort of who has moral authority and legitimacy in Jordanian society. So she's not explicitly part of a political movement, but she's quite concerned with some basic tenets of, what's legitimate, what's right, what's moral, and so implicitly is challenging the kind of dominant the forces of the state and the regime. And there are ways in which she does that more clearly. Like, for example, I'll just give you one more example and then kind of get to my analysis more of this. One of the things that she frequently criticizes are these patriotic events at school, and she criticizes them on the grounds that there is music in them that is forbidden, and that the girls who perform in these patriotic events get up and sort of dance in front of a co-ed audience, or mixed-sex audience. And so she never directly says anything about the state, but she continually criticizes the music teachers, criticizes the girls for participating in these events. And she's not the only one, but she's quite vocal about it. I'm sitting with her one time, and she says to me, "It pains me to see this Muslim man carrying an instrument as one of the music teachers walked by." And so she has a very clear critique of these musical performances, which are almost all patriotic. So there's a music program at the school, but the music program is essentially taking the kids out to perform on patriotic events. So in that way, she really is. I mean, and I have actually a whole chapter that's not about the religious education, where I talk about what are these kinds of critiques of the patriotic events, what sort of underlies them. And so in that sense, it is a pretty serious critique of the sort of more of legitimacy of the state. So I'm thinking about sort of the questions that my data or my observations kind of raised for me. And these kind of clear contests. I mean, the clear contests over authority are perhaps not that surprising, although always within limits, right? There are debates about what the proper Islam is, but there are some limits around this. And there's one incident in which somebody sort of goes outside of these limits where that debate is completely shut down. But there are some regular debates about what does it mean to be a good Muslim, and particularly what does it mean to be a good Muslim woman, and what does this entail in terms of proper modesty, what does this entail in terms of appropriate participation in public life. So this is the constant, these are the constant terms of the debate between Ms. Suhaib, between Amina, and others involved in this debate in the school. So I thought about this question of why Amina is given this space, and one of the key reasons, I think, well, there's sort of three reasons, but one of the main reasons, and I actually talked to the principal a little bit about the prayer room and the role of the prayer room in the school without specifically talking about Amina to her. And from the perspective of the administration, the religion plays an important role, which is keeping the kids in line, keeping the girls in line. It's sort of another means of social control in the school. So the way in which they viewed these girls in the prayer room was, oh, they help us out. You know, we tell them to give a lecture about not wearing makeup to school, and they help the girls, behave better. And in some ways, it's about social control. But I don't mean to imply that they're disingenuous about this, because many of the adults, most of the adults, are concerned that these girls grow up to be good, moral people. And for many of them, being a good Muslim is part of that. Now, whether the administration actually understood what was going on in detail in the prayer room, I don't think so, because surprisingly, they spent very little time observing or monitoring anything that was going on in this space, even though all other kinds of extracurricular activities were pretty top-down affairs at school. So this is part of what sort of made me start wondering, how did these girls just get to do this? And no one ever asked them what they're doing and what they're talking about. But from the perspective of the administration, it was under this sort of general rubric of teaching the girls to be better Muslims, teaching them, and getting them to behave better. Whereas when the...
Just ask you something
sure.
Quickly. Was Amina appointed? How did she get to be the leader in that?
There was, I think she was voted by the committee of prayer room kids. Yeah,
The kids.
Yeah, the prayer room kids.
Section.
And they have a faculty advisor, but the faculty advisor doesn't really, and I asked them, does anyone ask you what you do? They said, well, at the beginning of the year, we give them a list of things that we say we're going to do. But I rarely even saw a teacher go into the prayer room, except if they were invited to come in and talk about something. And the only time I saw the administration sort of try to rein them in is if they were hanging out in there too much. And then so you'd hear someone over the speaker system say, the girls in the prayer room, you're supposed to be in class. Go back to class. Or, these sorts of things. Or, I heard a teacher comment, those shoes have been outside of that prayer room for too long. I wonder what they're doing in there. Because they were allowed to use the prayer room during their recess and break, but they weren't allowed to just leave class. Technically, they weren't allowed to leave class and hang out in there. So there were these attempts to sort of keep them under control, but not really any kind of looking into what's going on in there. And again, not that what was going on in there was necessarily so foreign in the sense that the there are many other spaces in which this perspective on Islam might be conveyed to these young women, whether it's on TV, a particular preacher. I mean, there were other, but it just, given the way in which the control over knowledge is, and the concerns about the control of religious knowledge in school, given those kinds of concerns, it's surprising to me that they're, and perhaps under a different principle, they wouldn't have been given as much leeway. I mean, part of it is how this sort of unfolds in one school. The other thing I think about is, so she's a student, so she's seen as relatively harmless, right? Whereas if a teacher was in there doing a lot of this, then there might be a lot more repercussions for the administration for letting this happen. And the other thing is she's, and this is just my own kind of trying to make sense of this, she's a female, and sort of the image we have, not just here, but there, of extremism and threat is a male image. So how much is her being a female make her seem like less of a threat? And if we even consider her to be a threat, but I mean, is she given that space? If this was happening in a boys' school, would this be different? If this was a male student, would this be different? I think it probably would, but again, it depends on a lot of other factors. I also think about Ms. Suhail and sort of the significance of who she is. So on the one hand, she is not diverging from the official kind of script, right? Islam in moderation. We need to be modern and Islamic. We need to be open. Women can be what they want to be. Women have a role in Jordanian society. On the other hand, a lot of this is laced with a critique, a class kind of critique, a critique about privilege, and a critique about access to resources in Jordan. And in part, that is explained by her own status as sort of a professional, but not really economically middle class, and her own struggles to get a good job once she gets a PhD, and these sorts of things, which perhaps many of her peers. And then her own, she also resented the administration because she felt like she was putting all this effort into being a good teacher, and this was not valued or accepted. And again, this is something you could see in many schools, right? Teachers who put too much effort or who try to be better at what they're doing ruffle the feathers of those who don't want to be doing too much more. So this is not an uncommon kind of occurrence in a schooling setting, or sort of rocking the boat. And so a lot of her teachers, a lot of her peers, other teachers, as well as the administration, sort of were disparaging of her. Who does she think she is? Putting all this effort into her classroom, kind of thing. So there was also a personal kind of thing going on. Yeah, sure.
Did you ever have a chance, did you ever just hang out with the teachers? Did they socialize or go to any of their meetings and see their interactions with her? And how did that play out?
The teachers had their own little cliques. So she had 2 or 3 sort of friends, and then there were other cliques, and they would not disparage each other to me, but I picked up on some of this stuff because she herself complained about it, and because of a couple kind of off-cuff remarks that people made about her.
Was she sort of early career, mid-career?
Mid-career.
So she
Yeah.
sort of average age.
Yeah.
And she came from a lower middle class background?
Yeah, but which the majority of these teachers probably did. I mean, the majority of teachers did. I mean, there are some exceptions.
Was she the only one that had a PhD, or a lot of them did?
She was working on her PhD when I was there. There was another teacher who had just gotten her PhD. There were 2 others working on them. There were others working on master's degrees. I mean, so
not really mobile.
yeah, although for many of them, getting the PhD didn't change what their options were. But and once she got her PhD, those who were disparaging of her previously were like, "Oh, what good did it do her? She's still teaching at our school, I mean, but this was sort of the tensions between the teachers that were kind of unfolding in the school, and what good did it do her, right? So then I was thinking about the class So I was thinking about her and her role, and very much sort of her thinking about herself as practitioner was a big part of why things unfolded in a particular way in her class. She did small group discussions. She was very consciously trying to tie what was going on in the classroom to what was going on in their lives, and always would say, she'd connect it to something. Oh, have you been to the market? And when you go to the market, or have you watched this program? Or I know you guys all watch Star Academy. And so she would get on, so she was constantly, and this was a very conscious, and she said she would try different methods each semester. I mean, it was a very conscious process for her. But then I thought about the class itself and religion class as potentially conducive to this kind of discussion, and particularly this religious class, right? So this kind of how to be a good Muslim in one's life. And it reminded me of a class, I went to Catholic school, that we took in our senior year of high school. It was called the Ethics. It was just called Ethics, but it was really about sort of how to be an ethical person in our lives. So it wasn't like freshman year was Old Testament, sophomore year was New Testament, and then, all this, it was a much more doctrine, and it was ethics, and just thinking about how that opened up the course to so many potential paths. And then my sister and I each took this class about 6 years apart, and we had dramatically different experiences in this class because of how our own teachers chose to frame it. So the curriculum is left open, but the teacher ends up having quite a significant role. So that was one thing I thought about, this sort of, once we start thinking about the contemporary moment and religion and living as good religious people, what does that open up? But then I was also thinking about in the context of Jordan, right, where there's very little room for debate and discussion about social, political, cultural life, right? What might be the potential of religion class? In a context where there's quite a good deal of suppression of any kind of political criticism or any kind of free speech. And in a context where religion is generally seen as something positive, good, right? Particularly in the context of the school, where the school, religion is also seen as a threat in Jordan, but in the context of the school, this is seen as sort of a safe place to explore these things with young people, and as the arena in which the state has the chance to do this. But I was just thinking about sort of, maybe in a false way, there's this sense that this is a safe space for this kind of debate, discussion. False from the perspective of the state, right? Like this may be more challenging to the state than it thinks. But because there's so little room for the kinds of things that the state talks about, like critical thinking and problem solving in other classes, how does the religion class then end up functioning as this space of critique? Whether it's a critique that we see as more conservative or progressive, or whether this is one of the few spaces in which these kind of debates might unfold. Now, this is, again, about this particular type of religious curriculum, because there are lots of other religion classes that are about doctrine and memorization. But in a class where, all 10th and 11th graders are learning about what it means to be Muslim and all these kind of dimensions in their life, what does this sort of open up? Yeah, sure.
Did you follow those students outside the classroom, like into their lives? And this is the kind of study you're like thinking, I wonder what happens with them in 5 or 10 years, like what will they do? What was the impact of having had this experience and being a part of this particular kind of space?
So I ended up visiting like 25 perhaps families, and then ended up having sort of a subgroup of those families that I visited frequently and I've stayed in touch with. And then I have been sort of trying, initially just because there were people I cared about, I'd go back and sort of ask, how's so-and-so doing, how's so-and-so doing? I see a group of teachers pretty regularly. But last year I actually sort of very consciously was trying to track particular students and see where they were, and most of these students now are in their early 20s. They're either in the university, or if they haven't gone to university, they might have gotten married, or they might just be sitting at home because they couldn't get into the university or couldn't afford university. So I am kind of following them, trying to, But in some ways, they're still very much in contingent kind of places, a lot of them. Meaning, a lot of them are at the university and still sort of trying to figure out some of what they're figuring out, what they were trying to figure out here. It'll be interesting to see, I think, in the next few years, how some of this unfolds for all of them. Amina, I didn't see, but I heard she did what she wanted to do, which is she went to a community college, married a very religious person, moved to the capital, and is quite happy, is what I've been told. But I haven't had a chance to talk to her. Ms. Suhail is not teaching any longer, is trying to get a job at a university, but has been trying to for 3 years now, to no avail. I guess the only other thing, I guess just a couple of other concluding thoughts, and then I'll just see if anyone else has questions. So I've already talked about the sort of significance of the centrality of debates about gender to debates about proper faith and religiosity in Jordan in this particular moment, and the ways in which public debates, bigger than the debate, the more general kind of public debates in the media, amongst officials at the national level, are very much also debates about the role of women in Jordan today, and the role of religion in public life. And women are actively involved in this, which is, part of my wanting to really engage with what's going on in school, is trying to focus on how teachers and students are really engaged in this in the day-to-day, and sort of trying to figure this out and negotiate what are sometimes quite contradictory messages about this, and sometimes they're not contradictory. Sometimes, some of the actors are quite sure of their vision of what the proper path is for young women. And so how these kind of different truths come into interaction with each other in the space of school. But I want to go back to the point that I also mentioned, that the school sort of saw religion as overall a positive force. And for most adults in Jordan, overall, religion is seen as a positive force in young people's lives, you know, seen as part of sort of growing up to be a good moral person. And schools in particular, right, not just in Jordan, everywhere, see as part of their mission this idea of pointing young people in the right direction, making them, you know, helping them become good citizens, good moral, upstanding citizens. And perhaps this is changing. I mean, even in Jordan, when the teachers talked about their role, they talked about how they felt this was beginning to change, their role in sort of guiding students, because of all the emphasis on more technical kind of role of the teachers. And this is changing everywhere, perhaps. But the importance of school and the importance of sort of pointing young people in the right direction, but then thinking about how today in Jordan, pointing them in the right direction takes on a particularly religious tenor in a way that it might not have in the past. Not that religion wasn't important to people in the past, but religion wasn't necessarily so separated out from ideas about what it meant to be moral and good. They were sort of subsumed within each other in a way that today perhaps is not the case. And education is a large part of the reason of why that's not the case. I mean, this is back to Gregory Starrett's book. He talks a lot about sort of the functionalizing of faith and the way in which religion is objectified and sort of laid out as a set of particular sort of lessons and content that one needs to learn and then apply to one's life. So it's a way of sort of parceling out religion that may not have existed in a previous time. And a lot of the work on education and faith talks about this, talks about the ways in which religion gets compartmentalized and the ways in which people conceive of religion in their lives in a different way as a result of education, as a result of the way in which religion is taught, but also as a result of the way in which people begin to see themselves as consumers and producers of knowledge as well. So in that sense, schooling itself triggers particular debates because it formally presents religion in a particular way, in part to ensure the good behavior of students, right? In part and good behavior on the level of the principal being concerned with good behavior, but also on sort of the state's part of trying to sort of control the socialization of young people and their minds. And then schooling also provides new images of what proper personhood is, and that's a very gendered kind of image. So then how does this end up interacting with these debates about what it means to be proper Muslim? Because you can no longer think about that outside of the debates about, well, in a modern Jordan, what does it mean to be a modern woman? What does it mean to be an educated woman? What does it mean to be successful? These are all sort of intertwined with debates about what is proper faith. What does it mean to be a pious woman in Jordan today? I guess I'll just open it up for questions. Yeah.
I have at least two questions.
Sure.
The first one is thinking about Suhaila's directive, do whatever you want. Right? And just do whatever you want is, I mean, it's a directive first of all, and it's sort of disciplinary.
Yeah.
You know, this is somehow I'm formulating a model through which you should somehow envision yourself and fashion yourself as a subject in my classroom. But it's also within the context of this greater social order.
Yeah.
And so there's something definitely implicit in the be whatever you want, so long as it sort of, you know, so I guess I would be quite cynical of this sort of statement based upon the fact that some of these women that you've sort of tracked, these girls you've sort of tracked, are in these contingent roles trying to figure things out and then perhaps just sort of falling into models of womanhood that have not particularly been transformative or... So I'm just curious about that sort of tension that she's setting up within this sort of the fashioning of these girls' lives, which in fact seems to be largely muted or just very ineffective. And I'm just curious. I'm a little skeptical about what that means, and I'm curious about what you might think it means in sort of this order of subjecthood.
Yeah.
And then my second question is about conflict, and I mean, there seems to be such a great sense of civility around everything. I mean, everyone sort of seems to like, perhaps it's all very hampered, and I'm familiar with this in Tunisia too, in the sense that people, yes, everything's always good, and then one turns away and is spitting, and then one turns back and smiles, and there's a sense in which, what kind of conflicts did you encounter? I mean, is there resistance from families in any way to this? I mean, are there instances, are girls pulled out of school? Are girls, what are the sort of breakdowns of this sort of possibility of sort of a harmonious, educated system?
Oh, it's not harmonious at all.
Yeah, okay.
On many levels. But just to your first question, to sort of be whatever you want. I mean, it's funny because when you initially started to ask that question, I thought you were asking something else, because I always thought it was sort of disingenuous, because for many of these girls, the possibilities were not there. And
Is that because of class or their gender?
class or gender. So it wasn't necessarily gender, it could be class. And she was quite aware of those kind of class barriers, and she talked about it all the time. She talked about kids who had gotten good grades but couldn't go study at university. She talked about how people bowed to doctors but they didn't give any respect to teachers. And I mean, so she talked about this kind of stuff all the time. And her students were tracked as well. So you had students who had been tracked into the sort of literary humanities track, and the science, and students who had been tracked into the science track, and they were already being valued differently as a result of that. And so she would often sort of identify with the humanities students and talk about the fact that no one values the kind of work that you do. So on one level, I thought about the fact that some of the students probably just saw her words as empty because they didn't feel that these were real possibilities. But on the other hand, much of what she said was not something that hadn't already occurred. All right, there were doctors in the community who were female. There were already models of that, so it was not that unimaginable. But I think so in some sense, I think I don't know if I'm even answering your question, but this idea of sort of you can be whatever you want was very much about her discourse and narrative about Islam and modernity and the problem with tradition. But in some sense, I felt like, not that she was doing a disservice, but she wasn't really speaking to the reality that some of these young women were struggling with. But it was never talked about in explicit terms, but it's an important point that I probably should give more weight in this. Sort of how her message is received and what is the impetus for her message. And then also her own sort of, she sees herself as an authority as well, very much so. And this is going to another one of your points, right? In that she's sort of disparaging all these other ways of seeing things, but she sets herself up as an authority as well. And despite her efforts to use what are sort of more student-centered kind of methods in the classroom, she often ends up being the center of, I ended up sort of writing out a lot of the pedagogy stuff in here, but I may write it as a separate article or something. So she tries really hard, and she's conscious of what it means to be doing different kinds of teaching, but she ends up being the center and the authority over and over in many respects, because it's a real struggle, I think, to hand that over. Just as a practitioner, right, to hand that kind of control over and know how to do it and to have the skills to do it. And this is someone who's, so on a couple of levels, I think you're right. And the conflicts, there are all kinds of conflicts. If we're thinking particularly about religious education, there's one sort of very big conflict that unfolds, although kind of quietly, but there's one girl who gets involved in this religious group, which is considered sort of outside the realm of the acceptable in terms of interpretations of Islam. She comes to school, starts talking about this to some of her peers. Amina throws a fit, goes running to her advisor and says, this student is bringing in these ideas which are completely unacceptable to Islam. This student gets expelled, but then gets brought back. So there are clear lines around, what's acceptable debate, and there are clear lines around what's acceptable debate, I guess. And then the parents of this girl were actually shocked to find out that they thought she was just going to some religious studies circle that was in the realm of the acceptable, but when they found out that it was this fringe sort of group that was completely new to Jordan, that was preaching things that weren't, in the ordinary or acceptable, they were worried too, and so there was all this sort of, how do we deal with this? But they were very hush-hush about it. They didn't have an open discussion about it with the students, and I had a hard time even pulling these facts out. The principal finally kind of filled me in. The student ended up coming back to school.
How did that happen? That's interesting. I think that's very interesting. What was the group? Yeah.
They're called al-Habashiyya, which literally means Ethiopia, but it's an Ethiopian who went to Lebanon and set up this, and actually it's funny because I just looked it up again today because I had a very hard time finding references to it at the time, and then I found one article, but then as I was rereading this, I was thinking I need to go back to that article and understand what this is. But so I don't know what makes them so different. I don't know doctrinally what makes them so different, but they are a group that was sort of organized and existing in Lebanon, have some Ethiopian roots, and then have spread throughout the region. I don't know, I see you nodding. Yeah. Yeah, so it was something I'd never heard of, and when I tried to ask her friends, they said, it's kind of like Shiite, and then they had no idea. And then, they were saying different things, and they were like, oh, and they say you're supposed to pray this way, and you're supposed to, the thing that the girls picked up on was they had a different way of praying. It was just, so I don't know, I don't know. And it was, but so that was completely shut down, as this is outside the realm of acceptable. She was expelled. In the end, as the principal explained it to me, is that they never intended to expel her, but they wanted to just frighten her. And that this was an agreement between the principal and the parents, because they wanted to make sure she wouldn't get herself involved in this kind of stuff, and then they let her come back. And then most of the students understood that she had had a disagreement and was disrespectful to one of her teachers. This is kind of the way they didn't want this to come out, because they saw it as so outside the acceptable. But there were other kinds of conflict all the time. There were students who were if you mean just in terms of behavior and control, this was not there were students who gave the school a hard time all the time, which is probably why the principal was hoping the prayer committee would get them in line, because there were some kids who were completely, just off the wall, out of control. The teacher just walks out because she can't get them to be quiet. And so, this is not perfect social control kind of place. There's all kinds of chaos and fighting, and kids get expelled, and there is some tension between families and administration, but it's often because, at least, all right, I got a lot more of the perspective of the administration on this, but the administration teacher perspective is the parents think their kids can do no wrong. Sound familiar, right? The parents think the kids can do no wrong, and they come in and basically defend and make excuses for their kids. And I saw some of that happen with one girl who almost got expelled, who then ended up transferring, almost got suspended, but transferred to avoid that. Father completely took her side, came to the school, argued with the principal, and said, why are you punishing her and not punishing all these other girls? And it was because she had a cell phone in school. They're, forbidden. So there were all kinds of ways in which they're brought into conflict. I asked teachers and parents all the time if they saw their missions as in conflict. I asked things like, is there anything about the curriculum at school that bothers you? I asked teachers, do parents have a problem with what you're trying to teach? No one ever explicitly said they had a problem. They saw the official kind of narrative as we're all in unison. We all have a shared kind of idea about what makes a good person. We all sort of committed. So there was, and the teachers were of the community. This was not, maybe a few decades ago, this would have been a different story when all the teachers had to be brought in. But 95% of the teachers grew up in this community. And so they were products of that education. They were products of a university education. They were the models of what an educated woman could be. Part of the problem is teachers are the most prevalent model. And some of the issue is, can girls imagine being other things, particularly in a community where there aren't that many jobs, right, for young women, because they're not in the capital. Yeah.
That's perfect. That leads right into my question. My question is about access. And you mentioned it as an issue a couple of times, and clearly there are, as you say, limits. But it's a kind of two-part question, the issue of how the girls are seeing their access expanding, and also the
access to, access to
whoever they want to be, or
okay.
to continue that theme, or various kinds of professional lives, or conservative professional lives. In other words, could Amina become a preacher of women? And what kinds of possibilities are there for the religious girls to do something within a sphere that's considered to be a little bit more public than perhaps previous?
Yeah.
Could I just tag on to that? I think that's really interesting, because what I was thinking when you were describing the sort of conflict between Amina and the teacher, you said Amina came from a prominent religious family, and I was Or
They were very religious, prominent,
Not
not so
prominent.
prominent. I mean,
Oh,
her
okay.
father had been a religion teacher, but had this whole life as a preacher outside of school. So they were not.
wondering if that played.
No, I mean, they were known as very religious people in the community, so they were prominent in that sense, but not as an elite religious
But
family.
there's one more piece
Yeah.
of it.
Yeah.
At one moment said something about elite corruption,
Yeah.
and that may play into access issues as well. So I was wondering if you could,
Yeah.
if you could expand a little bit on that.
Sure. I mean, I think the girls' own perceptions of what was possible had a lot to do with who the individual girls were, right? In part, it was defined by geography. They're not in the capital. A young woman, it's harder for a young woman to imagine moving. I mean, in fact, it's still quite a novel thing for a young woman in a city like this to go to the capital to work, although it's beginning to happen, right? You're beginning to have, there's better transportation than there was 10 years ago in the city. 10 years ago, when I used to go to this city, I'd have a very hard time getting to the capital, but now there's regular transportation. And there are these dormitories for women who want to work in the capital. So it's sort of safe housing for people who want to work in the capital, and there's some people who are taking advantage of them. It's still a small number. So there's both geography that constrains them. There's the economy. The economic kind of potential. So the girls might imagine it's possible because they know that women do this, but they might know that the reality is that they don't have the financial means. And some of the girls are quite conscious of these things in a way that is sort of way beyond their years. So they get quite strategic. They say, I'm 16. I'm not doing very well in school, which means I'm not going to get good enough grades to get into a public university. My parents don't have the money to pay for me, whereas a wealthy girl might calculate that the parents will pay for her to get an education even if she doesn't have the grades to get into it. So given that I don't have the money, I don't have the grades, why don't I find myself a guy and get married now? Well, I'm pretty and young, and I like this soldier I just saw down the street, and so even though this is sort of unacceptable, her going out to find a husband, there's this strategizing going on the part of the teenagers. So yes, there's sort of models. There are these models out there of the possible, but they're constrained by the realities that each of these young women face. And sometimes it's economic and structural. Sometimes it's because of what happened with their older sister, what their older sister was able to do or not able to do. Sometimes it has to do with who their brother is. Sometimes it has to do with a whole range of sort of familial factors, geographic factors. I think the biggest kind of struggles that were sort of maybe more across some of these issues is sort of what was desirable if you had some more issues, this sort of balancing family and work, and in the future, would I work if I have kids? And they're still young, so they don't really know in the end how this is going to play out, but it's things that when you start discussing, you realize that they hear a lot from their parents, they hear it from the teachers, they hear that these are things that women around them struggle with, so they realize that this is going to be part of their figuring things out. But the constraints are really, the economic and geographic constraints are pretty significant. And then when you meet a girl who, despite that, is still like, well, I'm still going to go to university. I remember saying to one young woman, you're telling me your parents have no money, your mother's divorced, not one of your siblings has gone to university, male or female, but you're so sure that you'll go. And she's just like, I just need to get the grades. I'll find a way. And to me, this was surprising, that she still felt this way, given the very material kind of realities. And the mother sort of seeing that the mother also seeing that they did not have the money to educate, thought the best thing to do was get her married as soon as possible, because given that the other options weren't there, this was sort of the best way to ensure she had some security, and they were poor, and too many unmarried daughters sitting at home and no income, and so there were all these, so I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Well, the elite corruption was part of it as well.
Yeah, the elite. So how does that fit into the way these young women imagine their possibilities?
Yes, but also how, if you could just tell us a little bit more about the kinds of cases that people were aware of corruption. If someone who considers himself a religious teacher is railing against this, it's coming up in society and people are beginning to talk about it. So how much of a space is there for talking about it? How much did you find out about?
Well, the government has all kind of anti-corruption things going on. So there is an explicit official discourse about doing away with corruption, but typically when people were talking about this, they were talking about this system of connections, right, in Wasta, needing to have powerful kind of connections to get certain things done. Now, everything sort of functions on these connections, and even sort of the non-powerful try and build these connections because almost everything is made easier by these. But there are ways in which, connection can get a scholarship for your daughter to study at the university. A connection can make sure you know, your son gets into this training program in the military for nurses, which is, you know, his ticket to higher education and a job. So it was really that kind of corruption, which, yeah.
That's exactly.
And so again, in terms of the calculation of these individual girls, they're quite aware of their family's own kind of capital vis-a-vis these kind of connections. And they're aware if they're kind of low on the totem pole in terms of access to connections. And I mean, some of them are more aware than others, but this is sort of central to the way in which resources are flowing. And even like, you know, getting into university and getting scholarships, and all of these are sort of heavily dependent on these kind of connections. Yeah?
Another question, in this country, sex education has been compartmentalized in the same sort of way you're talking about compartmentalized religion. Something that was used to be thought of as a family issue becomes part of public education, and it's controversial.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, how was marriage discussed in these classes? And I'm guessing this teacher is unmarried,
Yep.
and therefore assumed to be non-expert on the subject of sex education. And so how do issues of marriage, family life, and morality, which must be of interest to these girls?
Yeah, I have almost a whole chapter just on marriage and love talk at the school. But it's funny because Ms. Suhail actually wrote her master's thesis on the need for kind of a life skills course, and part of what she thought needed to be central to that was marriage and what makes a good marriage. And in fact, I just saw her again this summer, and she talked about some curriculum they've started in Saudi Arabia for like people before they get married. It's kind of like, you know, pre-Gana for the, you know, you go to a marriage course before you get married. So you try and understand what married life should be like. And so she was aware of it. She wasn't married. But, you know, there was definitely no sex education, although people talked about sex.
At school?
Yeah, but not in very big. Well, the teachers talked about it a lot, which was acceptable because it's acceptable for married women to talk about sex. But talking to unmarried girls about it is not acceptable. Now, marriage and life, I mean, there are sort of pieces of the curriculum that talk about marriage, but in a kind of less a sort of Islamic upbringing way, and more sort of what is the role of a woman in the Muslim family, and what is the role of the man in the Muslim family, what are the responsibilities of the wife, what are the responsibilities of the spouse. So there's that in the curriculum, but teaching about it, talking about it, I mean, I'm trying to remember if she did talk a little bit about it, Ms. Suhail, so there are ways in which I'm sure it comes up, and this idea of sort of what makes a good mother, and the problem with sort of backward ideas, and mothers with their backwards ideas, and but yeah, it didn't.
Was there a space to not be married? Was it so normalized that didn't even come up?
There are women who are unmarried, but this is seen as very undesirable and sort of even, very undesirable. It's like one of the worst things that could happen to you as an adult woman is not to get married. And there is this fear, this sense of sort of marriage crisis throughout the region, that people aren't able to get married for economic reasons, and men are getting married later, and so are women, and this is creating all kinds of problems. And then there's, every once in a while you hear stories like 30% of the women in this country are old maids, or whatever, and they're not getting married, and this is a major social crisis. So it's something that people are concerned with, but it's taking on a new kind of flavor because of the nature of marriage and the economic difficulties of getting married today. But, so there were several women in this school who were unmarried. In the past, most teachers were these sort of unmarried women who could travel to different parts of the country and teach. The majority of the teachers in this school were married and had families, but there were still some who weren't married. So in some sense, if it came up, I never saw it come up, I'm sure there would be some sense that she's not the authority to be teaching about marriage, even though she wrote her master's thesis on this topic. So, yeah.
When I conducted field work on educational development in Jordan, and I was wondering if you had found this as well, that debate with older women tended to be easier than with the younger women in terms of religion and sex, or like, so to speak, taboo subjects. And I don't know, maybe I pushed the envelope a little bit too much.
Yeah.
Places, but in one particular place called Nasriya, which some of the kids still live in, being to shop, the tents, the principal wore the niqab, and she was totally covered up. And I remember just asking her, like, so what's the deal? Bedouins were never religious before, like, what's going on? And Oman, which is supposed to be this, Islamic fundamentalist city, and the government's really scared of it. But and I had really great discussions with them about religion and what they thought about getting married multiple times, and they might not have agreed with me, but they left room for discussion.
Yeah.
With some of the younger teachers, they completely were offended by any sort of questions of this nature, and I'm wondering, do you think that's because they weren't alive, they didn't grow up during a time when there wasn't this sort of religiosity
Yeah.
growing up, or is it because of just life experience?
I don't know. I mean, I didn't quite have the same experience. I mean, Amina was one of these folks who had like sort of a very clear vision, but there were other, like some of her peers who are religious, but who were much open to sort of discussion about these things. But I think that there is this is a very generational shift too, right? In terms of religiosity, what it means to be a good Muslim, and this is throughout the region. These sort of new ideas about what it means, and it's very tied up with ideas about modernity and being educated, and so it's a new kind of like, being educated, an educated Muslim woman, and sort of distinguishing yourself from the traditions of your elders, as well as those really poor people who are uneducated who continue to practice religion in a bad way. So I think part of it is definitely generational, and you do hear a lot of the older folks who may have become more religious more recently talk about the way in which they lived differently, dressed differently, were differently a few decades ago. So perhaps, yeah, they can imagine different kinds of things. But I didn't end up encountering the same. There were all kinds of debates amongst the students as well. Yeah. Yeah?
You mentioned models, and Dr. Collins also mentioned models for the girl. What are some of the most popular models in terms of career, for example? Or do you have chances to talk about with the girls about the queen? Jordan has a very famous queen.
Yeah.
We didn't see one of the models for those young girls.
Her life could not be more divorced from the reality of these girls than mine. You know what I mean? Just like it's so divorced from the reality. So that doesn't mean some of them don't admire her, but just a reality that completely, it's just so many steps away from the reality of the majority of people in this country. So again, it doesn't mean that people don't see her as a model or admire her, or some people do, but it's just a completely different lifestyle, which makes sense. She's a queen. They're not queens. And she's a queen in the full sense of monarchy and privilege and these sorts of things. But models, I mean, I think the most immediate models are their mothers, their teachers, and teaching is seen as a good profession for girls, as it was for decades in this country, still is for some women. It's a good way to balance home and work. But there are other people, I mean, there are other possibilities that exist out there. But then how they sort of assess whether those possibilities are possibilities for them really depends on a lot of other factors as well. I mean, the official line of the government, too, has been very much to promote sort of women being out there and working in new fields. And you'll see sort of an article, a profile of a female plumber, female policewomen. Even there are female policewomen. So women are entering new fields in small numbers. I mean, in many ways, it mirrors women's own kind of entry into the workforce here. In many ways, not entirely, but yeah.
It seems that this can, maybe for book 2, look at the idea of cosmopolitanism, that these girls are kind of not, I don't want to say it's a backwater, and the transportation might be better than it was 10 years ago, but this reminds me of, Iowa Ong's book about Malaysian factory girls who go from a small town, they get to go to the big city and live in the dormitory, and their subjectivity shifts, even though they're constantly under the gaze of the
management and
their parent. But just, I mean, because I don't study religion, I'm hearing this through the lens of worker subjectivity, and this sounds though to be a very slow trajectory for these girls. And I'm wondering if the more transformative space for them is going to be through the way married women are imagined. Because if we already see women being educated in high school and then these PhD recipients who aren't able to realize their dreams, And then at the same time, you're telling us it's very intriguing that their singledom sort of frames them as failures on other big fronts. There's a lot stacked against them, so I'm wondering how you see this through debates about gender and globalization and the shifting of love. I didn't mean to say love, marriage, for a variety of reasons. And I also have one totally unrelated question. Didn't anyone challenge the preacher girl?
They didn't challenge her directly, but they kind of rolled their eyes and ignored her if they didn't like what she was saying. I mean, so there were a lot of girls who were bothered by her, for sure. There were other girls who kind of like attracted to her and became more religious, but there was lots of eye rolling, for sure, and sort of, there she goes again, kind of body language.
That's good.
Yeah.
They're teenagers.
Yeah. Debates, I mean, in some ways, globalization is already a pretty important factor here, right? So 10, 15 years ago, there are 2 state television channels and TV's on. I mean, so in terms of media access, and all these other kinds of images, that's already out there. And it figures into the way in which some of the discourse is constructed about these things, right? The teachers contrast with things on the media. They talk about music videos. So there are ways in which media is brought in. Amina watches a particular preacher, and she talks about this preacher. And Ms. Suhail says, oh, this preacher is better. So there's all kinds of ways in which ideas and images from all over the world are entered via satellite TV, which I don't go into too deeply, but I go into it when it comes up in the course of the classroom. I think that marriage and sort of the evolution of thinking about marriage and what a successful marriage is changing. I talk a lot about it in other parts of this work. This idea of getting educated to marry up, marriage as security, certain kinds of marriages as more security than other kinds of marriages. So marriage is very much about how the girls calculate, and their families, the usefulness of their education, their upward mobility. Again, not very different from some of the ways in which marriage functions here, right? I mean, in terms of sort of economic security, you marry well for economic security. So there are mothers, like, I always think about this one mother whose husband was sort of deadbeat and would go to another country to work and never send money home. And what does she want for her daughter? She wants for her daughter to marry well. I mean, that's the most immediate way in which she can imagine her daughter's quality of life improving, because she doesn't have the means to provide many other paths. And her life has been so difficult, and she's working all these menial jobs, and jobs that are really sort of low status, and she's really embarrassed to be doing cleaning offices and selling bread out of her home and doing, all these things which are not respectable from her perspective. So her hope is, but marrying up, you get a better chance of marrying up if you get a university education. A university-educated woman can get a better spouse. And so there are all these kinds of narratives circulating. But then on the other hand, you have the teenage girls calculating that, hey, there's this guy down the street who keeps looking at me and I'm not a good student. So there are all these ways in which marriage is key to sort of their fashioning of their future possibilities. And the idea of marriage is changing. And then at the same time, you have this sense of marriage crisis, right? And that the girls are getting married too late and the men can't get married. And so in some ways, education comes into conflict with this. So nobody's saying education is bad for girls, but in some ways the delay in marriage is about education, right? And so a calculation might be made, so these calculations get made about, more education, you have a good suitor, a potential suitor.
Is the payoff greater for the girls and women with the bigger degrees in the city? I mean, how much of this?
In terms of job access, you mean?
The payoff,
Yeah.
you marry even further up, or you actually can realize your worker bee selves.
Yeah, there are definitely more options in the big city. I mean, everything that's happening economically in the country is happening in the capital. I mean, the good jobs. And I mean, and some of these girls are going on to be engineers. They're going on to be doctors. And there's very little happening in terms of career opportunities for them. Or they're very unappealing. They have to go out to the free trade industrial zone that's like a half an hour from their city. And so even though it's geographically closer, it's so unappealing to be out in what is essentially, these QTZs. Yeah, so the geography is pretty significant here. Yeah, if they were in the capital, I think they could imagine very different kinds of things as a result of being in the capital.